Guys, I need to deliver a public service announcement today. So I just saw a TikTok where the creator made a very common logical fallacy. And that's thinking that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, when in fact it's very much not the case. And absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What does that mean? So just because you don't have proof or evidence for a certain event or phenomenon or thing does not mean that that thing or phenomenon or event does not exist. It just means it's inconclusive. The phenomenon or thing or event may exist or it may not exist. We simply don't know, just based on the lack of evidence for it. I hope that makes sense. To make it a bit clearer, let me give you two examples. First example, let's say you have a sneaking suspicion that tigers don't exist in the world. They're just a made-up animal. So what do? You decide to go out in your neighborhood and you scour it for signs or evidence of tigers. But you fail to find any. There are no paw prints on the ground. There are no tiger droppings anywhere in your neighborhood. So you come home and you conclude that tigers must not exist. End of story, right? Well, not quite. Just because you can't find any evidence for the existence of tigers does not mean that tigers don't exist. Right? For example, they may just exist elsewhere in the world, just not in your neighborhood. So nothing conclusive can ever be drawn from a lack of evidence. The thing, in this case, the tigers, may exist or they may not. Now, of course, this seems obvious to us. We know tigers exist. So the conclusion that this person drew just is obviously nonsensical. But I chose this example on purpose so that there's a stark contrast between the hypothetical and the real. All right, so now let's take another example where the conclusion is a little bit different. Let's say you have the unsettling sensation that Santa Claus may not actually exist, despite what you've been told throughout your whole life as a child and by the media. You truly think Santa Claus may not exist. And so one Christmas Eve, you decide to lay out cookies for Santa Claus. You decide to stay up all night to try to catch him in the act. And yet you fail to stay up because you're an adult and you are usually in bed by 10 p.m. But the next morning, you find the cookies still out on the table, uneaten. You see that your chimney has been untouched. And your Christmas tree is unfortunately empty, despite you being a goody two-shoes for the entire year. So what's going on? Can it be? Can Santa Claus be made up? Well, surely, right? There's no evidence for his existence, so we must conclude that Santa Claus does not exist. And you would be actually correct here. Oh, spoiler alert, sorry, in case that was news to you. But yeah, Santa Claus does not exist. At least not in the physical world, because we all know he exists in our hearts. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So you would be actually correct in your conclusion here, but not through any sort of logical principle, or at least sound logical principles, but just by sheer luck, by chance, you would have made the correct conclusion. Because once again, the absence of evidence for a thing like Santa Claus does not imply that that thing or Santa Claus does not exist. They may exist or they may not. So in this case, in the case of Santa Claus, we got lucky. So all this talk of absence and evidence may sound a little bit familiar because you learned it as a student in your logic class. Or if you're in the United States, in your high school geometry class, which is usually where you would learn all these logical principles. In particular, we're talking about the conditional statements that you would have learned in these classes. So as a gentle reminder of what in the world I'm talking about right now, a conditional statement is an implication of this form, this if-then form, where the P is the hypothesis and the Q is the conclusion. Sometimes we just refer to this as P implies Q. That's what the arrow means, implies. So we refer to these as implications. Now, in particular, we also have the inverse of the conditional statement, as well as the converse and the contrapositive, but it's the inverse that we're particularly interested in for our logical fallacy. Because the inverse of a statement is this: if not P, then not Q. Or simply, not P implies not Q. Not is just the operator that flips the truth value of a statement. So if something was true originally, the not version of that would be false. So if the original statement was, it is raining today, the not version of that would be, it is not raining today. Simple enough. And this is the crucial idea from logic. The truth value of the inverse of a statement does not have to be the same as the truth value of the original statement. They are not connected at all. Meaning the original statement could be true and the inverse of that statement may be true or false. There's no connection, logically at least. So what does that mean for our examples? Let's take the example of the tiger, right? The original implication, the original conditional statement, when applied to that example, would sound like this. If there is evidence for the existence of tigers, then tigers must exist, right? If P, then Q. What is the inverse of that statement? Oh, before I tell you that, the original statement is obviously true, right? If you have evidence for tigers, tigers must exist. That's a true statement. Okay, so what is the inverse of that statement? Well, following the form here, if not P, then not Q, that must mean if you cannot find evidence, or if you do not find evidence for the existence of tigers, then tigers do not exist. And that's false, right? That's why this is a logical fallacy, because making the fallacy would be assuming that the inverse is actually true, but it's actually false, right? If you cannot find the evidence for the existence of tigers, that does not mean that tigers don't exist, right? Like we discussed earlier, we just don't know. It's inconclusive. They may exist or they may not exist, right? So the inverse here is false. But making the fallacy would be assuming that it's true. That is the mathematical or logical way of framing our logical fallacy of the absence of evidence being evidence of absence. And it's a very easy mistake to make, actually. Yeah, as this TikTok creator made just a short while ago. Anyway, if you're interested, it turns out that the converse of a statement and the inverse are linked, meaning the truth values of the converse and the inverse will be the same. And likewise with the contrapositive and the original, the contrapositive and the original will also always share the same truth value. But that's a story for another day. We don't have to go into all of that business here. Just the inverse. Okay? So with that, I hope this all made some sense. I know I can ramble on for some time if I'm left unchecked, but yeah, hopefully the examples help clarify this fallacy for you. In any case, I want to thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed these videos. I always try to teach something in these videos so that you walk away from them a little bit more illuminated, let's say. So if you did enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing down below. I would greatly appreciate it. And I hope you are well and thriving and in good health and spirits, wherever you may be in our timeline. Yeah. And as always, stay sharp out there.